Test, test, test. Do you mind to move either that way or that way? Is that possible?
Do you mind to look at your like
No, that's completely fine. That's completely fine. Test, test. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me in the back? Test, test. Test, test. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Test, test. Test, test. Yes, this is better. And let's test the water in the bag. Maybe even too much. It's good, it's good. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, oh, do you mind to one less? Yes, because of the recording for quality purposes, as they call it, at the digital service providers, when you call them. Welcome another night, evening, afternoon, RTT. The second lecture out of a series of 4, and today I will try to touch on a difficult subject, and that is the scholarly research basis of subsequent lectures on legal research. And the idea is that I give you a service, that I offer you a bonus, that I assist you in your thesis writing with discussing the topics of today. However, I do realize that we will enter universes, we will leave maybe Earth, and in our brain enter spheres where we were not earlier, and that can lead to emotions, that can lead to frustration, and my preliminary statements are connected to that, and my biggest disclaimer and claim is that you have to produce a piece of scholarly work, and that you decided to enroll in an academic institution, and that you even paid tuition fee to do so. So I feel justified by that. Secondly, I hope that in the future we develop a vocabulary, a line of thinking on legal research that is informed and fostered and enriched by the general discussion on science and scholarship, which I will discuss today. So what I actually do is an investment in the long term. On the short term, there are two concrete items. I offer a sort of model with 6 steps that you could use in your brain in developing a research project, in designing and actually drafting a research proposal. So that is a goodie in terms of concrete outcomes. And the other outcome is a invitation to make a list of intriguing words I will use today, and to do some further research when you are meeting that word again in other lectures, in the coming weeks, in the tutorials, in the classes, when you think that that word as data, or the word thorough, or the word fact matters in your research project. Because I promise you that my colleagues are using similar words, and my claim is that they are actually the same words, but in the legal research, as of the next lecture, we are not in universes somewhere there, but we are in our little legal professional world, with doctrinal and empirical research and these types of things. So today we do discuss empirical, the word empirical, and then I hope that the goodie of tonight is that you have more confidence in those next encounters with colleagues in dealing with the definitions that are provided then, because I will show you a theory, a framework that gives a sort of support in consuming, in digesting these sort of magic words out there. That's our message. You are supposed to start using in your research, at least in the section research approach, research method, and research plan. And so those are the deliverables in the upcoming months. So that is the topic of today, but I promise you other themes that are not that concrete, but part of the bigger story, in my eyes. So if you feel uncomfortable there, hang in, and then wait until I land with my moon lander on this Earth again, and can reconnect. So that is the idea of today. It's part of the 4 lectures, I said that, and are there questions before we run off in the next universe? Are there questions pertaining to the previous universe we discussed, the universe of deadlines, deliverables, and stuff like that? All right, we move on. Thank you, meaning that you have enough confidence in your own study capabilities, good for you, that with the initial instructions you will do fine, and you will find out by the time the deadline is there. Not the least, thanks to the WhatsApp groups and other exchange of numbers you did in the breaks. So the third goodie of today is the break, where you are invited to finalize app groups in order to have a heads-up system for approaching deadlines and other clarifications among yourself. Very important. Okay, then the approach is called theorizing research, and the discipline No, the link with the assessment form is again very specifically 2 chapters in particular of the assessment form, being the research question and the chapter on argumentation, reasoning. And today is a definition of research. And to start with some words on that, there are various words in circulation that means the same. So what I try to catch are professionals that are not working for a concrete individual, that are not working for a concrete firm, that are not working for the state, but that are somehow, with a salary, doing whatever they like between 9 and 5 in an academic institution. And that has names like research, like science, but the Anglo-Saxon definition of science is 99% the natural sciences, like physics, biology, chemistry. And the colleagues are in those areas called researchers or scholars in the humanities, as in religion, philosophy, languages, sociology, and or social sciences as a description. And then, I didn't want to put it on the slide, but let's do it like this, that in the European continent, there's a sort of umbrella term for all these flavors of scholarly activity, and the German word is Wissenschaften. And the Dutch understanding of research, so the Utrecht University understanding of research, is this all-encompassing word Wissenschaften. The Dutch word is wetenschap, including the guys in the laboratory and the guys and girls in the libraries in terms of humanities, history, philosophy, languages, and social sciences in the sense of sociologists, psychologists, and the like. So what we discuss here are the general characteristics of the whole group, because legal professionals are somewhere in this spectrum. We don't know where. So in certain countries we are part of humanities, certain countries we are part of social sciences, certain countries we are not regarded as a scholarly discipline in the first place, and in other countries, like in Germany and the Netherlands, legal scholars are somewhere in this Wissenschaften cloud. We are sort of satisfied with that because at least we seem to exist. But tonight we will discuss, this afternoon, that when it is about sort of hard facts and sort of rigorous natural science approaches, we fall short. We have not that much sort of proof in the offering compared to chemists studying molecules or physicists who study gravity or time or stuff like that. So we try to interpret these words and research, and that is me doing interpretation, that is the LLM, so your whole program, the sources you use, and multidisciplinary sources, and my claim is that this is not the first time you will listen and deal with this, but your future career will be part of it too. The next step in terms of an overview of this Wissenschaften world out there is that there's a tradition not that long, only 150 years old, to distinguish between theology, philosophy, sociology, and the like. Prior to that, all the persons that were professionally doing sort of experiments and thinking were regarded philosophers. And step by step, the current modern specialized sciences were split-offs of the mother discipline called philosophy. So philosophers for thousands of years asked questions what the matter is about, or what afterlife is about. So stuff you can see and stuff you cannot see. And then the natural philosophers dealing with matter thought, okay, let's skip the discussion about the afterlife, let's just zoom in, specialize in the molecules and leave the rest to the others. And that happened on multiple occasions with the effect that also the organization of universities progressed and transformed into the faculties we know right now. And only after the establishment of these types of departments, we could invent a new world, a new word, being multidisciplinary research. Because if it is one discipline, you don't need multidisciplinarity, because you're part of one family of thinkers and experimenters and the like. So it matters to know which disciplines, also for your LLM thesis, you are dealing with. And the tragic news is that we are not having consensus what type of disciplines exist. Because people invent new disciplines along the way. So even a label like psychology is not very precise, because the world of psychologists is divided in theoretical psychologists and therapeutic sociologists and social psychologists and all kinds of other subdisciplines who organize their work in separate buildings, in separate international organizations, in separate journals and the like. A little bit similar to our legal profession, that is divided in local law jurists and international jurists and law and tech jurists and all kinds of sub-flavors. And in those subfamilies we are sort of happy with each other. But tonight is about the fact that you can only explain and understand the reality out there to a limited extent if you stay in that sub-discipline. So somehow the feeling is that we need that multidisciplinarity to come to a fuller understanding of what you're writing about. For instance, in your thesis with the technology part of this LLM, there is technology inside your thesis. And that is a discipline where others claim, computer scientists and engineers and artificial intelligence experts who regard themselves as an independent discipline, and where others claim that it's their expertise. Yet, we need to say things about it. We need to describe, we need to understand, etc. And so the tragedy of the emancipation of the individual disciplines is that it didn't solve anything. So we are slowly but gradually in a movement in the opposite direction. That we try to enter those other disciplines and try to understand them, to include that in our own production. And that brings us to the question, well, could I categorize those disciplines out there? And we are not the first with that question, but Aristotle was one who paved the way. That's a Greek philosopher you heard about. And you thought, well, that's a sort of footnote of history. No, Aristotle is in our face. Because he put on the agenda themes we still deal with. So my advice is, in the context of this evening, to embrace and to revive your knowledge of Aristotle and put them on your radar and regard them, and that's funny in my view, as a fellow scholar dealing with topics you have to deal with. And disregard the fact that there are roughly 200 or 2,600 years between us and him. The good news, and for me fascinating, is that his texts are available, are translated in all the languages of the globe, and are easy to read. Ladies and gentlemen, we can read Aristotle as if he was alive right now and just produce those texts. Amazing. I talk about the original texts of Aristotle in translation. And quite often, attempts by me, by other scholars, educators, who try to summarize him, to try to summarize his ideas, do a lesser job than he himself. So it took me many years to actually start reading him, but it really helped. I'm not expecting that one sort of warm advertisement for our colleague who died more than 2,000 years ago will force you or trigger you to actually open his text. But the good news, it's translated in all your mother languages, so don't bother about the Greek. That's sort of nice for the Greeks. Yeah, but it's ancient Greek, so it doesn't help. And we will need him 3 times tonight, and right now is the first time, being his division of disciplines in 3 flavors. And he did so in a book called Rhetoric, in which we will find more instructions for our job to write a thesis. And he distinguishes between the theoretical sciences, the practical sciences, and the productive sciences. Mind you, 2,600 years ago. Theoretical sciences are the sciences where the product, a text, a presentation, is of non-tangible nature and not affecting the lives of people immediately. So theoretical in the sense that it stays in the territory, in the campus of the knowledge institution. And the equivalents today are, for instance, logic or physics and the like. The practical sciences, in his definitions, are the sciences dealing with the lives of people, as in politics, or as in ethics, and then ethics technically understood. So the study of right and wrong to very concretely decide in individual lives or in group lives what is allowed and what is not allowed, which does sound like law. And my claim today is that ethics is the same as law. Because in law we decide what is right and what is wrong, and those are ethical value decisions or choices. And the study of ethics, which is one of the 3 disciplines of philosophy I will show in a minute, is basically the same study as we do as lawyers. But somehow, in the current age, the ethics department of the philosophers is somewhere at a former cow field in the direction of Berlin, and the lawyers are here in the city center, and we do not have that much contact. So that's sort of one of the oddities already. And then the productive sciences are the sciences dealing with the actual material stuff like engineering and also the production of texts and art, according to Aristotle, is a sort of productive component of human expression. The funny thing is that from a LLM law and technology perspective, according to Aristotle, we are in all three areas. Because when we talk about technology, we talk about cars, self-driving cars, we talk about computer programs that decide on judgments or other legal stuff. We talk about medical equipment that can replace in the future human thinking and decision making, or replace all kinds of body parts, until as a legal professional we have to answer in 100 years the question, is this a human or a enhanced machine, and stuff like that. And so those are the stuff we are looking at. So science fiction partly, but also a thesis is a expression of text, is a concrete stuff, is paper and ink, virtually, and a product of a human being. So very product. It involves choices of right and wrong. All of your theses will end with recommendations like, this is good, this is not good, let's fine-tune this and this and this. So we are full swing into ethics, law, politics maybe even. And the assessment form chapter argumentation is the same as logic. That is theoretically. So your reasoning will be assessed, will be adjudicated on the basis of theoretical sciences. Does it make sense, what you say? And that makes already our project being, according to Aristotle, in all three potential sciences. And for me, that is good news. Because legal professionals, and when I look at you, on average, you like to be involved in everything and to decide how the future will look like. You don't care how Aristotle divides these segments in sections, as long as you are able to boss around your society, which is a good ambition, and there's quite a few stuff to boss around out there, so that is then in line. Ultimately, my claim of this slide is that philosophy is sort of the mother discipline where it comes to thinking about thinking, because all these disciplines, all these sciences involve the human brain, and the question today is, what is happening up there? Could we find words to describe it? Step 2, could we find tools to steer it in the way that your thesis is a brilliant expression of beautiful thinking? That's ultimately what I claim will happen. And then I theorize research with the help of a cube, and we will discuss that cube. And again, I mentioned this in my introduction, the theorizing is justified because this is an academic institution and you pay tuition fee to be involved and to be tortured tonight with my claims and ideas on research. When people show you metaphors or stuff like a cube or other visuals, you have to acknowledge or accept that that is part of modeling. So one way of expressing ideas is to create a model out of those ideas. And one tool in modeling is that you make a visualization of the model. So Aristotle had a model that science is three parts. There's a model of Montesquieu about public law, that a state needs three branches, legislative, executive, and adjudicative, in terms of a model, you know. Why do we call that a model? Because there are no atoms out there that has the shape of adjudication, legislation, executive stuff. Those are concepts, so non-tangible thingies, words. But we are so used to Montesquieu, trias politica, that we think it's a sort of real thing. And then in Dutch legal education, you study the Dutch state, and we conclude we don't have trias politica, because the legislative branch is not the motor of legislation, because that is the executive branch. So Mr. Rutte is producing draft legislations, pieces of legislation, legal instruments, and then the parliament is then sort of saying it's okay or not, and they do that with a preemptive strike called a coalition agreement, where for the upcoming 4 years they already agree to future legislation. So we live in a world where there's a model, then we think the model is sort of reality, and then we look at the reality and say it doesn't fit the model. That is what we do. So my cube is just one of the many models you encounter. I invite you to be very explicit. So in your thesis, if there's a model, call it a model. And say, it's not reality, it's a model. And it has a name, a hexagonal research taxonomy model. I like the Greeks, I don't speak it. Hexa means 6. And gonia in ancient Greek means angle or side. So hexagonal means 6-sided model. But it sounds much more expensive than 6-sided model. And cube model sounds childish. And there we go. We embrace the Latin and the Greek to sell our products tonight, a model. And I guess you're familiar with that. And here comes the practical component I promised. A cube has 6 sides. And your project will pass by all these 6 sides. And on the 30th of June, you close the cube, you hand in your thesis, and you're done. And in terms of the model, you have touched on all those 6 stages. Question in this stage.
Yeah, might sound like a stupid question, but when are we expected to start on our thesis?
Last week. The question is, when do we start with the thesis? And the answer is last week, in the sense that we had a lecture on what are things to consider in the whole trajectory. An alternative answer is you start writing the thesis
Last week.
somewhere May 23rd at 11 o'clock. And then what we discussed today is that the whole thingy in student language is called writing a thesis. The actual thing is that in your brain a research project unfolds. And the beauty is that since last week, your brain, some part of it, is already sort of starting to cook some ingredients, unconsciously and hopefully increasingly consciously. So, the RTT stands for research and thesis trajectory. So one very concrete definition is that you first do research, the topic of today, and then after finishing the research, you write a report on that research project, and the report is called the thesis. But somehow in Dutch universities, in continental universities, and in Anglo-American universities, we dislike the word report. Because report sounds like a annual report that accountants are writing for of Ernst & Young and KPMG for a company. So somehow, in the hierarchy of words, we think report is a very low, esteemish thingy. But technically, rewrite one. If you take it literally, that you first do a research project and then write a report. The natural sciences are doing it that way. They first spend half a year in a laboratory without word processing and just look at animals in a cage. And they count the movements of the animals. And then after half year of counting the hours that the animals sleep and the movement and stuff, they have a sort of data sheet on which all those movements are. And then, in 1 week, they write a thesis on their research project. And that is basically the metaphor I present you somewhere in December when we move to even more concrete tips and the like. But that is basically what we discussed. Let me outline the 6 squares briefly, being the first square, the research project square, connected to your deliverable research proposal. The second square is called ontology, an expensive word I will explain in a minute, dealing with your assumptions. The third square is the epistemology, connected to the knowledge and the interpretation of knowledge of your thesis. The fourth square is ethics, as indicated 10 minutes ago, the discipline deciding on right and wrong. Not just deciding, but theorizing about it. Then the fifth one is the data, the explanation and the forecast. So the sources, so the main part of your text. And then the sixth part are the conclusions, the answers to your research question, and your recommendations and other best wishes you include on the final pages of your thesis. So this is the outline, and tonight we will go over each of the squares one by one. And let's start with the first square, which is somehow concrete, because on top of this hexagonal research taxonomy, I fine-tuned that not only in a 6-sided square, but also in 6 steps. The first step is the description, but the first step, is the question mark, being the research question. So the ID, and we will discuss that in separate sessions, but in my taxonomy, there is this starting point of the question mark. And, no, let's discuss that right now. There are various sources of your question mark. And the first one is the request by a third party. So if we are lazy and we want to skip these lectures, we just give you a list of questions and divide that alphabetically, and then you are assigned to a question, and your job in the year would be to write a thesis on that question. That is a little bit your future, because somehow until your 40-ish year there are bosses around and they tend to give you on Monday morning a question mark, fix this. And then depending on your skill of mobilizing autonomy, somewhere you are solving that question. And, as indicated more often, there are quite a few question marks out there. Just open the newspapers and there's a very long list. And those could be rephrased as research questions, pertaining to climate, pertaining to gender equality, pertaining to algorithms, self-driving cars, robot judges, and the like. A other source, more close to you, of research questions is curiosity. So we do hope that entering this LLM is based on various forms of curiosity about the world out there, and that your thesis will be one of those topics and questions that made you curious in the first place. The next one is surprise or amazement. That in your writing, in your reading, including the main courses, you are surprised in the sense that you feel feelings like, I did not know that, ... and that is very strange. And then the plus package of that is shock. That you read stuff and that you think, this is outrageous, based on your assumptions earlier. So, one way or the other, the idea is that you encounter in the upcoming weeks these emotions, and that is then something you have to write down for yourself and potentially your research topic and question in the lab. And I personally like those questions that are having shock as source. Because maybe we should first, as professionals, deal with those. Because behind the emotion of shock is suffering out there. So maybe I'm not disqualifying self-driving cars and liability, and people die, and that is shocking, but they are working on it. And so maybe there are more pressing issues out there than an algorithm recognizing white stripes on the asphalt, etc. But those are beautiful case studies for bigger problems. So don't misunderstand me. I would buy such a thing if I had the money. So look for shock. If you're not a shock type of person, look for surprise. And if you're not a surprise type of character, at least mobilize in your toes curiosity. Well, and the short version of RTT instruction is, well, the whole research project and your thesis is an answer to that question. So give me a question, and then I only have to coach you how to answer it. And then in the course of the year we will discover, as you experience yourself, if you did it before, that you can tweak your question along the criterion of, can I answer it in the first place? Because sometimes you ask a question which cannot be answered. So philosophy spent 3,000 years on the question, does a divine exist? And they failed to prove it. And maybe the equivalent in our field, could there be justice in law and technology? That is most likely an unanswerable question, unless you mobilize a very specific methodology. And so I am not excluding anything. So the regular research is, give me a very concrete question and then just answer it. 15 credits, not too complicated. The way of answering such a research question is then divided in 6 steps. And those steps could be taken as a tip. First start designing the structure of your thesis like this. And then if you think it's too mechanic, it's too non-poetic, then start to make variations and beautify it. But my claim is that there are 3 first components. 1, description. So you describe the technology and you describe the law that you want to discuss. Like a journalist, like a scholar in a laboratory looking at animals. Just describe it. No emotion, no interpretation, just this exists. 2, step 2, you devote a lot of time and energy and text and lines on explanation. So your research question will always contain words like how come, why, to what extent, some W question. And that involves explanation. So you have various types of explanation. Explanation why certain things are as they are, or you explain how the law works, or you explain how the interaction between technology and law operates, etc. So there are various flavors of explanation, but they are all forms of explanation, and we will then look language-wise what is explanation, and then we discuss logic in a minute. And then we do a very important step as a scholar. We predict, we make a forecast of the future. In law, we predict that the law we studied will be applicable tomorrow. We don't phrase it that way, because it's sort of self-explanatory thingy, but that is actually what we do in our legal writing. We describe, we explain, other word for explanation is analyze, and then we make 99.9999% of the cases implicitly a forecast that our explanation is valid tomorrow. And that leads to the next 3 steps. Because, as legal professionals, we are used to say things about that future. And you have 3 flavors. The first flavor I call coping. One thing legal professionals do is that they say, this is my forecast. There's liability law out there. If you cause damage, you have to pay damages. That law will be applicable tomorrow, so if you break that car, I predict that you have to cope with the reality that you have to pay damages. That is a very standard tradition in legal profession to predict the future that way. The second flavor, and in discounting number 5, is that we have an opinion how you could change that future. And this list is also based on how psychologists deal with patients. Let's look at alcoholics. The equivalent of coping advice is, my analysis is you're an alcoholic, my prediction is you will be an alcoholic tomorrow, my advice is cope with it because that is what you are. The change flavor is, I describe alcoholic behavior, I explain that in medical terms you are an alcoholic, my prediction is you will be an alcoholic tomorrow, but there is an option for change. We have programs for that, AAA, Blue Knot, all kinds of things, popular in Hollywood movies. And then you can change from an alcoholic to a non-alcoholic. And that is what we do in law quite often. We describe there is no rule for this type of thing. Let's change the reality by making the rule. One flavor. Another flavor we see quite often in LLM theses. Your analysis is the current law is rotten because it conflicts with this one and this one, European Union, blah blah blah. And let's solve Article 27, paragraph 5, 6th alinea, also in consideration of case law of Luxembourg of last week, and then if we interpret it in a new way, we can deal with the situation in the future. So that is also a very common type of recommendation, advice. We base on description, analysis, forecast, don't forget that one, and then coping is boring, let's go for the change. And then there's a last flavor, a extreme flavor with the name transformation. We could transform reality. The equivalent of alcoholics is we could remove alcohol from reality. And actually we do that. in the Netherlands, with smoking, we experienced 10 years of transformation. So not coping. So in the past, my colleagues were smoking in this room. I kid you not. Then we changed to let's quit smoking. And now we are transforming that there's no advertisement for tobacco. And it's almost impossible to purchase it. So we are close to a transformed world where there is no cigarettes anymore. Well, maybe that takes a while. But remember that, let's talk about technology. We experienced tremendous transformations. There was a multi-million industry 125 years ago of transporting ice blocks from the North Pole to the cities of America and Europe. So people had jobs. Captains were the captain of the ships who went to the North Pole. People had jobs to cutting ice blocks and transporting it to the predecessors of the refrigerator in the houses of those cities. And then someone invented the refrigerator. This is a real story. And that whole industry does not exist anymore. So it was pretty dangerous. So there were labor law related accidents in the North Pole, limbs cut together with the ice, or people drown and stuff like that. And that is transformed because that whole industry is not there anymore. Well, a very ancient example, just to avoid to talk about Facebook and Instagram and all kinds of other thingies that are in our face right now, transforming our world. So those are the 6 elements of a project. And then the blue squares. Those are the hardcore philosophical squares and the most complicated ones. They are based on the mother discipline of philosophy. And they do link to your thesis in the sense that I write down holding your ground. So if we would increase the assessment and ask you, after you made an analysis and explanation, questions like, how do you know? What are the base assumptions? What are your biases underlying your ideas? Why is the European Parliament in charge? How do you know? Stuff like that. So that is one point. The other thing is being rigorous, being systematic. That is the fruits that you could derive from those squares, but they are tiring, and maybe it's too early in your career to deal with them. But tonight you heard a few things about it. Let's start with ontology. Ontology is the science, is the theorizing about the reality. And, believe it or not, there's no consensus which theory is the winner. And now that we legal professionals have to deal with everybody out there, we have to be appreciative to all of those flavors. Let's describe 2 extremes. So one extreme and the earliest extreme, of theorizing about reality is done by Plato, and his claim, I distort his ideas a little bit, but the bottom line of his idea is that everything we see is not real. That we are just a mirror of something, and then philosophers point up, leading to religions to say, yes, I know, that's the divine. So there's a reality somewhere else, and we are just a projection And actually, if you think of it, all the things we say, all the things we have seen, are first processed in our brain. So I see you, those are electromagnetic impulses in my eyes. They are transported in my brain, and I have a assumption that people exist, and chairs and buildings and recording devices, and so I say you exist, but I don't know. Maybe I'm the only soul on the globe and it's all a fantasy. The other extreme, people like Epicurus and others, is that everything is just matter. We are just a bundle of atoms, of molecules, and we are all the consequence of the Big Bang 13 billion years ago. We are just a coincidence. We walk, we have limbs, we speak, but that is just all a machine. And the thing we call choice, the thing we call free will, that's just part of the machine. Legal professionals are not a very big fan of this worldview, let's call it mechanism, because how do we redefine criminal law if this is the real interpretation of the reality? Because then, if I hit you in the face, then that's just caused by the Big Bang 13 billion years ago. Don't blame me. I'm just a bundle of atoms. And that is not very useful when you try to make sense of justice and topics like that. But it is a very, very popular worldview, ontology, because it feels so concrete. Take competition law. It's based on an economic theory that we are rational choice behaving machines. And the law is just to tweak that a little bit, that there's consumer happiness. But people adhere to this ontology, to this worldview, between 9 and 5, when they're physicists or so. But actually, statistically, no one on the globe has or adopts this ontology 24/7. Because also a thing like love and a relationship is just chemicals, you know? So psychologists discovered that we as human beings, we mate, let's talk about like mammal language, we mate with partners that of which the flavor, the scent, the sense is beautiful. And well, if you're in the age group between let's say 11 and 31, that's not a very inspiring worldview, isn't it? So even the most hardcore nuclear science scholar somewhere in the department of the university, after 5 o'clock, leaves that worldview behind and falls in love. And, you know, stuff like that. Then, philosophers, introductory books in philosophy tries to leave it at this point. And then claim things like, well, we don't know, there's no winner, let's sit a little bit in between. In between is crazy, because either you're atoms or we are an illusion. I mean, mixing is really not scientific and scholarly. Good news, according to scholars, there are 2 more flavors. The third flavor is called organism. That is viewing reality as a organism with a growth, with a development, with a purpose. So a seed has the purpose to become a tree. A little eye cell in the womb is the purpose to become a human being. We as a human being with our DNA has a sort of, we are programmed to follow certain stages. An infant, a juvenile, adolescent. So even our sort of bodily functions can transform in the course of your life. You can lose functions, you can get paralyzed and stuff like that, but you are still you. That view can be applied on not only individuals, but also on societies. In the 19th century, Romanticism, Hegel, there are all kinds of developments and people who adopted that idea and are also applying that to the law. That the law is a sort of growing mechanism with a sort of dot on the horizon called justice, and that we are all part of this sort of transformative, evolving thingy. And that is a very attractive worldview, but it is not very precise. Because it leaves open what the goal is. And we had in the history a few politicians who had a very peculiar definition of that organism. Very peculiar definition of who was part of the that societal organism, excluding people of color or stuff like that. So colonialism could then be sort of framed as, well, but it's just part of our organism, which sounds not as a very attractive sort of approach. Or excluding Jews or homosexuals or stuff like that. So the moment you start to define then that organism, you run into problems in terms of how do you distinguish, how do you actually explain. Is there then an engine to that organism? Well, people claim, well, the divine, that's the motor of it. So it's an attractive approach. In our personal life, we embrace it in terms, Stoicism among others, as in, well, accept the reality because we're just part of a development, and fate is also part of this story. So if you're paralyzed, that's then part of your story, and you can have training programs like Find Your Story and the like. Very attractive, very helpful quite often, but in scholarly terms, similar to the dream or the atoms, not very solid ground. And then the last ontology, last worldview, is based on consensus. That one we love as legal professionals, because then you define the reality as the stuff the majority thinks is true. So that's sort of democratic conception. And that's problematic too. Because if democratically we decide, well, the winner is materialism, we are just a machine, let's abolish criminal law and put, like in the Matrix, all human beings in a sort of plus-sized incubator and have robots run the world, would solve quite a few problems. What is then the bonus, what is then the upside of this worldview? I ask. But it's a recognized official worldview. Sometimes it's called pragmatism. And their dilemma is relativism. That you say, well, reality sort of doesn't matter. If you say this is real, cool, join the party. But it's a safe zone So in your thesis, if you're pushed in terms of your assumptions, it's a safe start to say, okay, let's start pragmatically. There is a European Union. We have in Article 2, 3 and 4 of this Treaty on European Union certain goals. As a community, we agreed to develop welfare, economy, internal market, etc. So you push away the deeper questions and you say, okay, let's accept this as our reality, which is already exciting enough, isn't it? Each of these theories are able to explain everything. So, in the dream category, you can explain matter as the idea that we need the idea and the dream of reality. It's not there, but we need sort of this feeling, including injuries. So if you lose your leg, that's just part of the dream that you connect to your leg. And you, okay, blood and bones and ooh, hospitals. It's in your head, but you need this sort of reality. That is why, according to that worldview, we are not angels in the afterlife, without hospitals and genocide. How do we explain that? Okay. Let's move to knowledge. Epistemology is the discipline discussing knowledge and the question, how do we acquire knowledge? And Aristotle, so the second time we discuss him, distinguishes between deixa and lexis. So out there we have deixa as in proof, matter, and lexis, so words. And based on these base words, in terms of the history of the word, you have the word apodactic. So one way of looking at claims is that it is apodactic, so beyond or deriving from facts. Those are then the theoretical and the productive sciences. Or what we produce in terms of knowledge is dialectic. And the literal translation, one of the translations is part of a conversation. So proof as convincing, persuading words between humans. And that is, in most of your thesis, the basis of the knowledge. So what we look for are convincing words as part of a conversation. So not the ultimate truth of limb movements of animals in a laboratory, but the words we share. And the logic behind this is that we developed, based on the work of Aristotle again, third time, a mechanism to weigh words. And that resulted in two main flavors. And the first one is the so-called deductive way of reasoning, and the other one is the inductive reasoning. And they relate a little bit to the worldviews. So deductive is that you start with an idea, and then you look at reality, and then you conclude with the words, dialectical, that a certain truth is true in terms of knowledge. Example, all humans are mammals. Ernst van Bemmelen is a human, so the claim is Ernst van Bemmelen is a mammal. And that is, in logic, a true statement. So logic could be complicated, and if you open a book in logic, you lose contact after 2 pages. Because of those abbreviations, A's and B's and stuff like that, we don't like that. But in normal words, the bottom line is, we talk about types of knowledge that we call true. And that is based on the structure of the sentences. And all your sentences in your thesis needs to be true, and at least based on this deductive way of logic, as you do 24/7 in your daily life. Then the alternative approach to knowledge, developed by Aristotle and further developed as of the 19th century, is the so-called inductive variation. That is not a complete different world, but just a different order of these steps, where the first step is to look at reality first. Count the bodily movements of the animal, the mammal, in the laboratory. Without theory, without ID, just looking, counting. And then you conclude that, for instance, swans are white, and then you develop the rule, so not the first step, but as the last step, all swans are white. Because I was in the park for a couple of months, and in my park there are only white swans. And this is the classic example in philosophy classes. We all know that black swans also exist. So the disadvantage of induction is that you do not know the stuff you missed. And then a solution to this is abduction, developed in the group of pragmatists. And then you develop a hypothesis. Then you loosen up the truth claim, and you reduce that to, let me test a theory. Another word for theory is hypothesis. My hypothesis is that when I walk to that door and open it, as you deserve for a break in a second, sorry for that, that when I move the metal down, then I can open the door. That's your hypothesis. And each time you actually open the door, that hypothesis is confirmed. And then, with repetition, you come to the conclusion that part of the door always opens the door. And in our discipline, we mix all those three flavors. So classic case solving is 100% deduction. Another word for that is syllogism. You have the rule, that is the theory. Criminals should be punished. Here is a criminal, end result, he should be punished. So all your law school exams were about deduction. Once in a while you had a sort of inductive, empirical experience, that you counted case law or you counted victims or stuff like that. That's sort of inductive. And then where it came to theorizing about markets or in family law, the well-being of children, you developed abductive reasoning. Like, I theorize, I hypothesize that a child with access to fathers and mothers has ultimately a better life later on, leading to legislation in the Netherlands and other European countries that even after divorce, children are entitled to visiting rights of fathers and or mothers depending on where you are living. Based on that abductive hypothesis. Because while the child is young, you cannot test the end result. You don't know. So induction doesn't help. So abduction is part of our spectrum. And algorithms are abductive. most of the time, if not deductive. Let's pause, apologies for missing the time, for 9 minutes. See you in a bit, and then we continue.